More than 100 schools have been told to close buildings that were built with a certain dangerous crumbly concrete which was used from the 1950s to the 1990s. New fears have been raised that the structures could collapse.
And it comes just before many schools are due back next week for the start of the new term. But why has the decision been made so late? We're joined now by Minister for Schools, Nick Gibb from Westminster. Minister, your job is to keep schools safe and to ensure the good and quality education of our young learners, correct?
Absolutely.
So why has this been announced 2 days before kids are due back in school, when you've had at least 5 years notice about the danger of this concrete?
We have been taking action to deal with this concrete since 2018. We've issued guidance in 2018, again in 2021, to schools. In 2022, we started a survey of all the schools. This is the first country to do this in the world and in the UK. So we have surveyed all 22,500 schools. We're asking them to identify whether they think they have RAAC in the schools. The vast majority said there's no RAAC. Where they thought they had RAAC, we then sent in surveyors to identify whether they do. And again, most did not have RAAC. But where they did identify RAAC, they then looked at it to see whether it was in a critical condition or whether it was of low risk and therefore safe to continue to use. So there are the 52 schools where we've already taken action to take buildings or rooms, or indeed, in a few cases, the whole school, out of use, and we've found alternative accommodation for those people. So that's already been happening in 52 schools. Now, what happened over the summer was new evidence emerged of a number of buildings, some schools, some in England, some outside England, some commercial buildings, where this notion that RAAC might be safe to continue to use, we found that they were unsafe. So there were buildings where RAAC had been identified.
Sorry, Minister,
yes.
When did you find that information out, and why has it only been published 2 days before schools are due back? Can I say this? Did you not make the following pledge, that you were going to publish information about at-risk properties before the Parliament summer recess? Have a listen to yourself speaking in Parliament and help us understand what you meant by it.
I can give a commitment that we will publish as soon as possible, and certainly before the summer recess.
And that hasn't happened, has it?
Well, we will publish. Look, this issue is new. It emerged over the summer.
Sorry to interrupt, but you made a commitment there to publish this, didn't you? Certainly before the recess, you said, and that hasn't been published.
That was about something else, because this is only an issue that's emerged over the summer. So over the summer, as I said, there were some instances where RAAC that we had thought was safe is no longer so. And so we took a decision over the summer. It's a very big decision to take.
Well, sorry, that report, Minister, that report included RAAC.
It was the condition of schools, wasn't it, that report dealt with?
So you thought it was safe and it's no longer safe, which...
Correct.
Right,
correct.
So when you made that parliamentary statement, was it correct or incorrect?
Well, I can't remember what that particular thing is about, but what this is about is...
It was about RAAC, Minister. It was about RAAC. It's what you said. Right. I'm not putting words in your mouth.
Look, we will publish the names of all the schools involved. What we want to happen, though, is we want parents to hear from the schools first.
Well, you failed to do that before summer, and how are you going to do that? I want to know, and I'm sure that there are many very nervous, to say the very least, parents out there, some of whose primary school kids are off to secondary school because the buildings aren't safe. How many schools are affected by this? The answer is you don't know. Your boss yesterday, Gillian Keegan, the Secretary of State, says we don't know how many because we haven't had the questionnaires back. Look, do you think that that's the role of a responsible, decent schools minister?
You're getting very... Look, we have done more to identify where RAAC exists in our school estate than any country in the world, more than other governments in the United Kingdom as well. We have these surveys...
Sorry to interrupt,
let me just finish. We've been doing these surveys since 2022 to identify that, and we've already taken action in 52 schools.
You're the British minister. Nobody cares. You don't get medals.
And to be honest, I just wanted to say, you know, parents who are listening right now will be looking at sending their children into schools, and you potentially, it seems, don't know whether there are extra schools that might be at risk of this that haven't yet been identified. Can you guarantee to parents sending their children back into schools, that those schools are safe? Because it seems that there are a number that you don't yet know could be affected by this.
We know more about our schools in this country than any other country in the world.
You keep saying that, but that's not much of a consolation for parents, is it?
Look, it's an important point. We are being absolutely cautious, abundantly cautious, in dealing with the safety of our schools. This is a world issue. It's an emerging issue. We know more about our school estate than any other country in the world. And we have taken action already in 52 schools. Now, what happened in the summer was we had new evidence that meant that 100 of those 156 schools, we need to take extra measures in terms of the rooms or buildings that have the RAAC that we previously thought was unsafe.
I think
that's the decision that we took over the summer.
Again, but, you know, when we're talking about the safety of children, I think a lot of people will be very concerned to know that everything that should be done is being done. And when you talk about, you know, new evidence coming to light, a school roof collapsed in Kent in 2018. Luckily, this happened at the weekend, so children weren't hurt. How do we know that this won't happen again? Why wasn't action taken then when a school roof collapsed? This was 5 years ago.
Yes,
and you know that a lot of schools were built at the same time as these ones. Yes. We know that 14,900 schools were built during the time when this concrete was used in construction.
Look, action was taken in 2018. A warning notice went to all schools. We gave advice to schools about how to identify RAAC and how to manage it in situations. We then went one step further as a government, more than any other government, to survey, to ask schools to identify RAAC or suspected RAAC in their schools. Then we went in with surveyors to see if it was in a critical condition, and then we took action with over 52 schools. Now, we want to go one step further, and we're saying that where RAAC is identified, and we have been able to identify it in our school system, there's more work we're still doing on that, but we are way ahead of identifying it than any other country in the world. So you can be more assured as a parent in this country than any other country in the world that we are taking this issue.
You still don't know the exact numbers, do you?
We know there's 156 schools where we have confirmed RAAC. And there are some surveys still to come. The vast majority of those surveys are in and have been processed. There are some still to do. But what we do know is that even when you have those surveys in, the vast majority will say there's no RAAC. And even if they suspect RAAC...
Sorry, Minister, 2 days before the beginning of term, you know, kids have already suffered in lockdown. Many of them are going to be learning online or in, to say the very least, inadequate accommodation. What about the cost of all this? Are you going to guarantee that all of the cost of temporary accommodation and housing these pupils is going to be met by the government?
Yes, we've made that very clear. We will, of course, pay for all that, all the repairs that are being done, the propping, the porta cabins that, in some circumstances, may be needed. Look, we put the safety of pupils above everything else, but we are talking about 156 schools out of 22,500. And when those other surveys come in, the vast majority will not have RAAC. And where we do suspect RAAC, we will be sending in surveyors this week and next week to confirm one way or another whether there is RAAC in that school, and then action will be taken. We have a caseworker working with each of the schools involved to help them provide alternative accommodation or propping or surveyor advice to make sure that the most children can stay in
Can we
education.
just clarify on this point on the costs? Because the National Education Union is pointing out the fact that the government states in its guidance it will not be covering the cost of emergency, temporary accommodation or additional transport. So while you might be covering the cost of the building repairs, of that work that needs to be done, it seems like the other costs, the emergency, temporary accommodation, any transport, anything that schools might have to sort out, they will have to pay out of their own budgets.
No, we will. No, that's a misinterpretation of the wording of the guidance, and we're going to clarify that wording so that the NEU doesn't make that mistake. We will pay for porta cabins, temporary accommodation. There is an issue about all the capital costs for alternative accommodation and remedial action in the school. We will cover that. Right. There is an issue about revenue costs, and we will have discussions on a case-by-case basis.
Sorry, what does that mean?
schools.
Sorry, I do apologise. You know, I know school leaders and heads of various school trusts, one in particular. What does that mean in English? Just to be clear, you're going to look down the camera and tell school leaders and parents you will be meeting all of the costs of this. It's not going to come out of the pocket of any school or any school trust, correct?
All the capital costs
What does that
will
mean?
be met. Well, capital is things like buildings, so temporary accommodation. If we have to use porta cabins, we will, of course, pay for the porta cabins. There is an issue about revenue costs, things like transport, and that we will deal with on a case-by-case basis with the school involved. So, of course, we're going... Safety is everything. That's the most important element of this decision. But you need to bear in mind the scale of this compared to 22,500 schools. We're talking about 156 schools. We took swift action when that new evidence emerged to change the guidance to school. It's the sensible thing to do. It's the responsible thing to do. And we are more advanced in this than any other country in the world.
I hear every other country...
And I'm delighted today that Wales has taken the same approach.
Minister, I do have to apologise. We don't have all day, and there are parents who are worried, to say the very least, about sending their kids back to school, whether it's going to be safe or whether they're going to be shut. You know, just very simply, I asked you at the beginning of this interview whose responsibility it was. Where does the buck stop? You said, it seems to me, with you are the Schools Minister. You made a statement to Parliament as clear as possible, saying you were going to give information about the at-risk schools. You don't know the number of schools that are safe. This happened, and this was made clear 2 days before kids will go back to school, causing the absolute maximum disruption. Schools Minister, you know, it's as simple as this. It's a question of responsibility. Is it time for you to resign?
No, we are more proactive on this than any country in the world, including other administrations in the UK. We know more about our school estate than any other school. We have been absolutely assiduous in identifying RAAC in our school system. That's why we know the 156 schools. That's why we have taken action on 52 schools that we know have RAAC that's in a critical condition. And the vast majority of those surveys have come in. There are still a few more to come in. And when they come in and they think they might have RAAC, they will have a survey done this week or next week, as soon as that information comes in, to identify whether they do have RAAC. Schools know, we've been giving them advice since 2018, how to identify RAAC and what mitigations to put in place if they do find it. So parents in this country, I know it's frustrating for the parents of those 156 schools, but parents in this country can be more assured about the safety of their school buildings than any other country in the world because of the work that we have been doing, particularly since 2022 in those surveys. And that's why we know about the 156 schools. And I'm delighted that Wales today have announced that they are also starting this survey, something that we started in 2022, because it is important to identify where RAAC exists. But, of course, schools throughout the UK have had advice Minister, about how to handle RAAC.
Minister, we've heard what you've had to say. By any stretch of the imagination, if I was to characterise this as incompetence and a disaster, I'm sure you would agree with me.
It's not at all, no. The fact is, because we have been proactively seeking the evidence and finding out about any new cases, whether they are in schools or in commercial buildings or in this country or in other countries, that's what we have been doing in the department, seeking out this evidence because we know of the issue of RAAC. And it's by looking at and seeking that evidence and then taking a very difficult decision and being subject to all these kind of questions from journalists like you as a consequence. But we put safety of pupils and staff first above everything else. And that's what
I think, unfortunately, there still seem to be a lot of questions about why action wasn't taken sooner, but we will have to leave it there. We're out of time. But Nick Gibb, thank you for joining us this morning.
My pleasure.